Hello and welcome. I am Gimba Umar. Tonight, Vice President Yemi Osinbajo set to waive his immunity to legally clear his name of all allegations and insinuation against his person in office. National Assembly receives medium-term expenditure framework and fiscal strategy paper from President Muhammadu Buhari with keen attention to global and domestic developments. Tonight, we'll continue our series on Nigeria's independence anniversary with a special focus on the country's power sector. And White House releases transcripts of President Donald Trump's phone call with the Ukrainian president as Mr. Trump denies withholding U.S. military aid to Ukraine as leverage for trials involving Biden's son.
Our business news tonight, House of Representatives to probe 5.4 trillion naira accumulated debt owed AMCON amid reluctance from its debtors.
And sports news tonight, fastest man in 2019, Christian Coleman insists he's never used performance-enhancing drugs ahead of the World Championships in Doha.
And from Abuja, Vice President Yemi Osinbajo presides over Federal Executive Council meeting with Council approving 109.4 billion naira for Phase 2 of the construction of Ibadan, Ilesha, Ife and Kano-Katsina dual carriageway.
The Vice President, Professor Yemi Osinbajo, is talking tough, and he says that he is ready to waive his constitutional immunity to enable the most robust adjudication of what he describes as several baseless allegations, insinuations and falsehoods against his person and office. The Vice President made this declaration today in a social media message he personally authored on his verified Twitter account. In one of the tweets, the Vice President says that in the past few days, a spate of reckless and malicious falsehoods have been peddled in the media against me by a group of malicious individuals. The defamatory and misleading assertions invented by this clique had mostly been making the social media rounds anonymously. He went on to say that he has instructed the commencement of legal action against two individuals, one Timi Frank and another Catch Ononoju, for allegedly putting their names on some of the publications. The legal battle between the federal government and the Process and Industrial Development (PNID) over the failed oil contract is not over just yet, as the Federal Capital Territory High Court today granted bail to a former director of legal affairs at the Ministry of Petroleum Resources, Mrs. Grace Taiga, who was arraigned for her alleged involvement in the controversial contract. The court, in a ruling today, said that the prosecution failed woefully to provide reasons why the defendant should not be granted bail. She was therefore granted bail in the sum of 10 million naira and two sureties in like sum. The court, presided over by Justice Olukayode Adeni, however, ruled that it will not make any order for Ms. Taiga to submit her international passport because of her health condition, but she must nonetheless not leave the country without first informing the court and her sureties. Ms. Taiga is accused of facilitating the controversial contract and securing gratification to the tune of over $20,000 while she served at the ministry in 2010. The contract, reached between Nigeria and PNID, an Irish multinational firm, had resulted in $9.6 billion judgment debt against Nigeria by a court in the quoted kingdom. Mr. Femi Falana, the counsel to the publisher of Sahara Reporters Omoyele Sowore, says that despite fulfilling the bail conditions of his client since morning, the Department of State Services is yet to release Mr. Sowore in line with the order of a federal high court delivered by Justice Taiwo on Tuesday. In a telephone conversation with our correspondent, Mr. Falana explains that no reason had been given by the service for its failure to comply with the court order. Justice Taiwo had ordered Mr. Sowore's release after hearing arguments from both the prosecuting and defense counsels. The judge, however, said that since charges had already been filed against the activist, he must deposit his passport and other travel documents to guarantee his availability for trial. The DSS arrested Mr. Sowore on September the 3rd over his call for revolution protests scheduled to hold on September the 5th. From legal matters, we turn our attention to the National Assembly, where lawmakers today received the medium-term expenditure framework, the MTEF, and fiscal strategy paper, the FSP. President Muhammadu Buhari forwarded the MTEF and FSP in letters addressed to the Senate President and Speaker of the House of Representatives. Our correspondent, Linda Kibe, reports.
Medium-term expenditure framework, MTEF, and fiscal strategy paper, FSP, is now in the hands of the National Assembly. The planning documents come with a covering letter addressed to the Senate President and Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Given our shared objective of returning the budget to a predictable January-December fiscal year with effect from 2020, I hereby forward the 2020/2022 MTEF FSP to the distinguished Senate and trust that it will be expeditiously considered in order to facilitate the 2020 FGM budget preparation process.
But once again, the President is sending the MTEF and FSP late to the National Assembly in breach of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. Section 11 of the Act states that the federal government, after consultation with the states, shall not later than 6 months from the commencement of the Act cause to be prepared and laid before the National Assembly for consideration of the medium-term expenditure framework and fiscal strategy paper. Despite this delay, the Senate President has repeatedly said the National Assembly will pass the 2020 budget by December 2019, a feat which has been near impossible in previous assemblies. In the MTEF document, the federal government's expenditure framework is estimated at 9.12 trillion naira, which is slightly higher than the 2019 budget of 8.92 trillion naira. Interest payment on debt is estimated at 2.45 trillion naira, while provisions for personnel cost is at 2.67 trillion naira. Donor funding and grants in NTEF for the federal government's expenditure budget is put at 36.39 billion naira, and this is a topic of debate after the presentation of the MTEF. A lawmaker raises a concern on a lack of donor coordination in Nigeria and the failure of the National Planning Commission to ensure an alignment of donor assistance with national priorities.
The Senate should be concerned that the National Planning Commission is not effectively performing one of its stewardship roles of ensuring alignment of donor assistance with national priorities.
These are the part of the type of issues we are going to look at. How do we do the regulatory framework to know what the type of person who is coming, the aid that is coming? What is the purpose?
No nation can grow from outside. Every nation must grow from within. So we must be careful how we collect aids before it turns to AIDS.
At the end of a debate, the Senate directs the National Planning Commission to put together a framework which will ensure development cooperation and aid effectiveness in Nigeria.
Those against any, the ayes have it.
The federal government very recently has continued to reiterate its commitment to improve access to electricity to homes and businesses in Nigeria. Some of the offline strategy is the ongoing electrification of schools using alternative sources. In continuation of our independent special reports, our energy correspondent Olu Phillips brings us details on some of the challenges in the power sector.
After many attempts at reforming and improving the power sector in Nigeria, spanning several years, the most significant in history were those carried out in 2013. In simple terms, the country transited from a completely public-owned power sector to private investors. From the various power plants built, investments made, and rehabilitation, and other interventions, electricity peaked at over 4,000 megawatts in February of 2014, the first since independence. Since coming on board, the current administration have taken a drive at improving what they met, which has not yet happened, despite claim of huge investments. The immediate past Minister of Power, Works and Housing, Mr. Babatunde Fashola, had a template for improving electricity supply, essentially incremental power, steady power, and all-interrupted power supply. Still, the average that has gotten to homes and industries across the country averaged 3,500 megawatts after 4 years.
Everybody should be disciplined to ensure that we are all focused on what we signed for. Distribution companies should ensure that meters, electricity distribution substation are enhanced, networking is enhanced, employ more personnel to do monitoring. Regulators should enforce all the regulation to ensure that they comply to the regulation. And all other agencies that are informed, ministry to formulate more regulation to ensure every stakeholder are involved and do what they ought to do.
When the electricity industry was fully privatized, it was done on the platform of several factors and agreement, rules of engagement. How that event has affected increase in supply remains a major talking point, especially for consumers who are at the receiving end of epileptic supply. Consequently, the industry has witnessed liquidity squeeze and gaps in regions of billions of dollars, several contractual obligations, some gone bad, others still in the works, while some may become subject of litigation if poorly handled, for instance, the Mambila project. Metering is hot on the plate, and in bridging that gap, the Meter Asset Provider Scheme was introduced last year, essentially another form of deregulation which allows new vendors in the electricity space. That is still work in progress, as it has not scaled up significantly.
I assure Nigerians that they will continue to be seeing meters being rolled out, whether from on their neighbor's wall or their own. And we will be able to close this gap, and that is the ultimate goal of the Commission, to close the metering gap within the next 3 years, meaning that by 2021, all Nigerians today who are consumers of electricity should be able to have meters on their walls.
Having a meter doesn't also guarantee steady power, but when it is provided, it should be paid for, which underscores the back and forth over tariff.
The way the power chain actually works is from the bottom up. It's not from top down. The consumer must be ready to pay before the distributor will go and buy the power, before the transmission company will carry the power from the person who's making the power. So it is the other way. The willingness of the consumer, the ability of the consumer. Don't forget, it's not just willingness. Ability, effective demand is what kicks power.
These facts and many more may have prompted the federal government to the signing of a power roadmap with Siemens of Germany earlier in the year, a government-to-government agreement that hopes to deliver 11,000 megawatts by 2023, which again is grossly inadequate when compared to the country's population of over 200 million people. The outcome of that agreement may not take us to the required destination, but it definitely will take us away from where we are today. Want an improvement, and legitimately so. The DISCOs, GENCOs, gas suppliers, the regulator, government, and everyone in that value chain. But until we agree that technically we all want the same thing, which is regular power supply, we may continue to disagree on how to achieve that, and until then, our generators will continue to grind holes in our pockets. Olu Phillips, Channels Television News.
In part 2, after the break, more on Nigeria's electricity challenge. We'll be joined on the news at 10 by the COO, Ibadan Electricity Distribution Company, Mr. John Ayodele. Plus, President Muhammadu Buhari condemns Ghana's coup attempt, insists days of coups and governments without votes in Africa are over. Join us again.